August 3rd, 1907, 11:04 p.m., Dean Martin's home, Beverly Hills, California. Dean sat in his study, reading, glass of apple juice on the side table. The house was quiet. His daughter Dina was staying with friends. The staff had gone home hours earlier. Just Dean. Alone with a book he wasn't really reading. Just turning pages. The way you do when your mind is somewhere else. The phone rang. Late-night calls were never good news. Dean had learned this over 40 years in show business. Somebody died. Somebody got arrested. Somebody needed money. Somebody wanted a favor. Never good news. He picked up on the third ring. Hello? Silence. Not dead silence. Breathing. Someone on the line but not speaking. Hello. Dean said again. Then a voice. Slurred. Thick. Barely recognizable. Dean sat forward. He knew that voice. Even slurred. Even destroyed by whatever pills were in the system. Yeah, Elvis Presley said. It's me. Dean looked at the clock. 3:47 p.m. in California, 2:47 a.m. in Memphis. We're at Graceland. You okay? Dean asked. Because clearly Elvis was not okay. The voice was wrong. Not the usual wrong. The pills, the exhaustion, the pressure of being Elvis Presley every second of every day. A different wrong. A final wrong. Elvis laughed. A sound with no humor in it. No, he said. I'm not okay. Dean waited. Years of friendship had taught him when to push and when to wait. This was a waiting moment. Elvis was quiet for a long time. Dean could hear breathing. Could hear something playing in the background, music. One of Elvis's own records. Can't Help Falling in Love. Playing in Graceland at 2:47 in the morning while Elvis Presley sat somewhere. Bedroom, bathroom, wherever. With a phone in his hand calling Dan Martin. I'm dying, Dean, Elvis said finally. Dean's grip tightened on the phone. You're not dying. You're just tired. No, Elvis's voice was certain. I'm dying. And I wasted it all? You were right. Elvis interrupted, his voice breaking now. Actually breaking. You were right, I should have listened. Dean closed his eyes. Because he knew exactly what Elvis was talking about. The conversation they'd had. Years ago, 1969, after Elvis's comeback special. When Elvis had called him at 2 a.m., just like tonight, and asked how Dean stayed himself when everyone wanted him to be someone else. Dean had told him, stop performing when you're not on stage. Keep something back. Keep yourself separate from the character, or the character will eat you alive. Elvis had listened, had nodded, had agreed, and then had gone right back to being Elvis Presley 24 hours a day until the performance, and the person became so tangled that neither one could exist without the other. Listen to me, I never stopped, Elvis said. Crying now, actually crying. I never stopped performing. Not once, not ever. I don't know who I am when I'm not Elvis. I don't think there's anyone there anymore. Dean's eyes were wet. There's someone there. No, Elvis said. There's not. That's the problem. I looked. I've been looking for years. There's nothing, just Elvis, just the performance. And the performance is dying. So I guess I am too. Dean stood up, pacing now, phone cord stretching. Combe, stay with me, Dean said. Jet on a plane tomorrow. Come to California, we'll figure this out. Too late, said. Elvis said. Way too late. At Dean. Elvis's voice was quiet now. Almost peaceful. I just wanted to tell you were about all of it. The performing, the pills, the keeping something back. I should have listened. You can still. I love you, Dean, Elvis said. You're the only one who ever told me the truth. The only one who wasn't scared of me. The only one who saw me. Thank you for that. Please. I gotta go, Elvis said, and the line went dead. Dean stood there, phone in his hand, dial tone buzzing, and for the first time in decades, maybe the first time anyone had ever seen, Dean Martin cried. Not quiet tears. Real crying. The kind that comes from knowing you just heard someone say goodbye. Nobody knew about that phone call for 40 years. Nobody knew what Elvis said in those final minutes. Nobody knew that Dean tried desperately to save him. Nobody knew that Dean Martin, cool, composed, unshakable Dean Martin, broke down after hanging up. 3 days later, Elvis Presley was dead, and Dean Martin never watched another Elvis performance for the rest of his life. The story stayed buried until the people who'd been close to both men decided the silence had lasted long enough. By August 1977, Elvis Presley was dying in ways that the people around him could see and could not stop. The final tour had been a catalog of deterioration. Performances where he forgot lyrics, where he sat on stage because standing had become too difficult, where the voice that had redefined American music emerged in fragments from a body that was failing systemically. The weight gain was visible and extreme. The pills, the prescriptions that arrived in quantities that no legitimate medical need could justify, sourced from doctors whose practices existed primarily to supply famous patients with whatever they requested, had moved past dependency into something more fundamental, more architectural. Elvis's body no longer functioned without pharmaceutical intervention. He needed pills to wake up, pills to perform, pills to come down after performing, pills to sleep, pills to counter the effects of the pills that helped him sleep. The circle was complete and it was closing. The people closest to him, his girlfriend Linda Thompson, members of the Memphis Mafia who'd been with him for decades, his father Vernon, had watched the deterioration with the particular helplessness of people who care deeply about someone they cannot reach. Linda had left earlier that year, not from lack of love, but from the recognition that love was insufficient against what was happening, that staying required watching something she couldn't bear to watch. Ginger Alden was with him now. The machine that was Graceland continued to function. The entourage, the schedules, the demands of being Elvis Presley, because the machine had momentum that nobody knew how to stop, including Elvis himself. Nobody who was there in August 1977 needed to be told something was wrong. The question was only how wrong and how soon. Dean Martin and Elvis Presley had existed in the same industry for long enough to have developed the particular kind of friendship that famous people sometimes find with other famous people who understand the specific pressures of extreme public life. They'd met in the mid-1950s when Elvis was ascending and Dean was already established, when Elvis was the new thing that was reshaping American music, and Dean was the older generation observing the reshape with a combination of respect and wary recognition. They were different in almost every way that mattered publicly. Dean, the Italian kid from Ohio who'd built his persona on studied coolness. Elvis, the Southern boy whose relationship with performance was emotional rather than constructed, who gave himself to audiences rather than managing the distance between himself and them. But they'd found in each other something that crossed the surface differences. A recognition. The recognition of two men who understood what performing cost and who handled that cost in ways that were diametrically opposed. Dean managed it by keeping the performance separate from himself, by the apple juice and the 30-year distance between Dino and Dean. Elvis managed it, or tried to manage it, or failed to manage it, by surrendering himself to the performance completely, by believing that if Elvis and Elvis Presley became identical, there would be nothing left to lose. Dean watched this approach with an admiration for Elvis's talent that was genuine and absolute, and with a concern for Elvis the person that grew steadily through the years as the approach revealed its cost. The 1969 conversation, the one Elvis had referenced on August 13th, the one that had preceded the final call by 8 years, had happened in the aftermath of Elvis's comeback special, the television event that had re-established him as a cultural force after years of movies that had diluted what made him essential. The special had been a triumph. Elvis had been magnificent in it, and he had called Dean Martin at 2 in the morning from a hotel room somewhere, still running on the adrenaline of performance, and asked a question that Dean recognized immediately as coming from a real place rather than the social questions famous people ask each other at parties. How do you stay yourself when everyone wants you to be someone else? Dean had answered honestly. He described the apple juice, had described the 30 years of Dino Crossetti keeping his hand on his own shoulder while Dean Martin did the work in public, had explained the discipline of the line, the absolute refusal to let the character cross into the person, the practice of being Dino in the private hours no matter how completely Dean occupied the public ones. He'd told Elvis that the performance could expand to fill any space available to it, that it would take everything if you let it, that the only protection was a deliberate, sustained, daily commitment to keeping something back. He'd told Elvis directly, with the bluntness that their friendship allowed, that he was watching Elvis give everything to the audience and that he was afraid of what would be left when the audience went home. Elvis had understood, had said so, had described with a clarity that surprised Dean the way performance had already begun to feel more real than everything else. The way Graceland and the entourage and the constant movement and demand had made ordinary life feel not just impossible, but actually terrifying. A silence he didn't know how to be in. Dan had recognized this as the most dangerous thing Elvis had said. The silence terrifying meant the performance had already become load-bearing, had become the structure that kept everything else up. And load-bearing structures can't be removed without collapse. People who had heard fragments of the story about Elvis's final call to Dean, fragments that leaked in various forms in the years following both men's deaths, developed 8 theories about what the call had actually been, what it had actually meant, and why Dean had never spoken about it publicly. All 8 were wrong in ways that illuminated why the truth had stayed hidden and what the truth actually was. The first theory was that Elvis had called everyone that night, that Dean was one of many calls, a standard Elvis behavior in his final period when the pills and the isolation and the late hours produced rambling, scattered phone contact with anyone whose number he had. This theory was wrong. The people who reconstructed Elvis's final days found no evidence of a calling spree that night. The call to Dean was specific and solitary. The second theory held that Dean had exaggerated the significance of the call in the years after Elvis's death, that guilt and grief had retrospectively transformed what was a routine drunk phone call into something more meaningful and portentous than it had actually been. This theory required believing that Dean had spoken about the call at all, which he hadn't. He'd carried it in silence. The third theory suggested that Elvis had been so heavily medicated on August 13th that nothing he said carried genuine meaning, that the words were pharmaceutical rather than personal, the expression of a man whose mind was no longer reliably connected to his actual thoughts and feelings. This theory contained a fragment of real uncertainty about the reliability of a heavily medicated person's communications, but was wrong as a complete explanation. The words Elvis used, the specific reference to Dean's 1969 warning, the particular clarity of the acknowledgement, indicated a level of intentionality that the pure medication theory couldn't account for. The fourth theory held that the call had been brief and incidental, that the 23 minutes Donna's account described had been inflated, that the actual call was much shorter and far less significant than the story made it. This theory was wrong. The fifth theory proposed that Dean had tried to go to Elvis after the call, had attempted to travel to Memphis in the days between August 13th and August 16th, had been blocked by Colonel Parker or the Graceland entourage. This theory was wrong. Dean had not attempted to travel to Memphis. He'd understood, from the call itself, that physical presence wasn't the variable. The sixth theory blamed Colonel Parker directly and completely, held that everything wrong with Elvis's final years was Parker's management, that Dean had known this and that his conversations with Elvis had focused on Parker as the cause and removal as the solution. This was wrong as a primary explanation. Parker's management had caused real damage, but Elvis's relationship with performance, his inability to separate himself from it, preceded Parker and would have existed without him. The seventh theory was the strangest one, that Elvis had dialed Dean by accident, had been trying to reach someone else and gotten Dunn's number by mistake, and that the call's apparent significance was a product of misrouted desperation rather than deliberate choice. This theory was wrong in every verifiable detail. The eighth theory held that Dinah Martin had constructed or significantly embellished the story for her memoir, that Dean had never mentioned the call to her, that she had assembled the account from wishful thinking and incomplete information. This theory was wrong. The details Dinah provided, the timing, the content references, the aftermath she witnessed firsthand, were corroborated by enough independent fragments to establish their fundamental accuracy. All wrong. The truth was more tragic than any of them. This wasn't just a phone call between two famous men. This wasn't just Elvis Presley reaching out in a dark moment to a famous friend. This was a goodbye, a final conversation between the only person who had warned Elvis about the cost of fame and the man who had paid that cost with his life. Dean Martin had watched Elvis destroy himself for years, had watched the pills take over, had watched the performance consume the person, had watched a man he genuinely cared about disappear inside the character he'd become. And 3 days before Elvis died, Elvis called to say you were right. Nobody knew about this call for 40 years. Dean never spoke about it, never used it for sympathy or legend building, never told anyone what Elvis had said or what he himself had tried to say back. He just carried it, in silence, for the rest of his life. If stories like this matter to you, the private moments of tragedy, the goodbyes nobody heard, the truth behind the legend, subscribe now. There's an entire Dean Martin playlist of these moments. The witnesses who came forward in the years after both men were gone gave accounts that built the picture of what August 13, 1977 had meant and what it had cost. Dinah Martin, Dunn's daughter, wrote in her memoir about coming home that night to find her father in the dark. She had not known who had called, had only known that something was catastrophically wrong because her father's face, which she had watched for decades maintain its composure through everything life had offered, was wet with tears. She described it as the only time in her life she had seen him cry. Not misty, not moved, crying. She wrote that he had told her simply that Elvis had called and that Elvis was not okay, and that the way he said it had told her everything about how not okay Elvis was. She had sat with him for a long time that night without speaking, understanding that whatever had passed on that phone call was not something language could immediately reach. Linda Thompson, who had been with Elvis through much of the decline and had left months before that August, spoke in a 2005 interview about the days immediately preceding Elvis's death. She said Elvis had been talking about Dean in the final period, had mentioned him more than once as the one person in show business who had spoken to him honestly, who had seen him rather than Elvis, who had tried to tell him something he hadn't been able to hear. She said Elvis had described Dean as the only one who understood what the performance cost, because Dean was the only one who had figured out how to pay it without dying from it. Jerry Schilling, one of the Memphis Mafia members who had been with Elvis since the early years, said in a 2010 interview that Elvis had told him, not in the final days but in some earlier period, that Dean Martin was the smartest man in show business. Not the most talented, the smartest, because Dean understood something about fame and performance and identity that most people in their world never figured out. Schilling said He wished Elvis had listened to whatever Dean had tried to tell him. Priscilla Presley, speaking in 2015 about the years of Elvis's decline, said she believed Elvis had known what was happening to him long before the end. Had known the pills were killing him. Had known the performance had swallowed the person. The knowing hadn't been sufficient to change anything, because knowledge and will were not the same thing. Because understanding your trap and having the capacity to exit it were entirely different conditions. Nobody knew for 40 years what had passed between Dean and Elvis in those 23 minutes. Nobody knew the specific words. Nobody knew what Dean had offered or promised or pleaded. Nobody knew the exact form that Elvis's goodbye had taken. The story existed as presence. The call had happened. Something significant had been said. Dean had been devastated by it, without the content that would have made it complete. Until Dinah decided the silence had lasted long enough. If someone you loved called you at midnight, someone you knew was in trouble, someone you'd warned years ago, someone you could hear dying in their voice, what would you say? How would you try to save them? What argument would you reach for when you understood that you were running out of time and that the person on the other end of the line had already made their decision? Den tried everything in that 20-minute call, every argument, every plea, every offer. But sometimes people call not for help. They call to say goodbye. If you want to know what Elvis said in those final minutes, the words that made Dean Martin cry, the confession that haunted Dean for 18 years, subscribe. The full conversation is coming. The full details of that August 13th phone call became available when Dean Martin's memoir was published, drawing on conversations she'd had with her father in the years before his death and on the account Dean had given her that night and in the years that followed. The call had lasted 23 minutes. Den had tried everything. After Elvis said you were right, after the line about wasting it all, Dunn had moved into something that the people who knew him would not have recognized as his usual mode, a desperation that stripped away the composure entirely. Listen to me, Dean had said. You're exhausted. You're on too many pills. But none of that is permanent. Come stay with me. We'll get you clean. We'll figure out who you are without the performance. Elvis' same hollow sound. I tried that once, he said. Fired Colonel Parker for a week. Thought I could just be a guy. Lasted 6 days before I couldn't stand it. The quiet was too loud. Den. When I'm not performing, I don't know what to do with myself. Then we'll teach you, Dean said. I'll teach you. How to be off. How to have a self that isn't the character. You've been doing it for 40 years, Elvis said. The apple juice? The Dino versus Dean thing? You learned it early? I learned the opposite. I learned to be Elvis all the time. And now I don't know how to unlearn it. Dean was pacing desperate, the phone cord stretching as far as it would go. It's not too late, he said. You're 42 years old. You have time. But you have to stop the pills. You have to stop the performing. You have to stop this. I'm already dead, Elvis said quietly. I died years ago. This is just the body catching up. That's the pills talking. No, Elvis's voice was certain in a way that cut through everything Dean was trying. It's the truth talking. For once, a pause. You know what I realized tonight? I'm sitting in Graceland. This massive house, 50 people living here, and I'm completely alone. Nobody sees me. They see Elvis. They expect Elvis, but nobody sees me. I see you, Dean said. I know, Elvis said. That's why I called. You're the only one who ever did. They talked about the 1969 conversation, about how Dean had warned him and Elvis had known Dean was right and hadn't been able to stop anyway. It's like an addiction, Elvis said. Being loved by millions of people. Being Elvis. I know it's killing me. I know the pills are killing me. I know the performing is killing me. But I can't stop. Because when I stop, there's nothing. Just this terrible, empty quiet. Dean tried to convince him to get on a plane that morning, tried to convince him to fire everyone at Graceland and start over, tried to convince him that life without performance was possible, that Dino existed and Dean existed, and the two of them together were more real than the character alone. But Elvis had made his decision before he ever picked up the phone. The call wasn't a cry for help. It was a goodbye. Near the end, Elvis's voice changed, got softer, almost peaceful. The peace of someone who has stopped fighting. "Thank you, Dan," he said, "for caring, for seeing me when nobody else did, please." "I love you," Elvis said. "You're the best friend I ever had. The only real one." "Then listen to me. I gotta go." Click, dial tone. Dean stood there for a full minute holding the dead phone. Then he set it down, walked to the window, and broke down completely. Dinah came home 20 minutes later, found her father in his study, sitting in the dark, face wet with tears. The only time she'd ever seen him cry. "Dad, what happened?" Dean looked at her. Elvis called. "Is he okay?" Dean's face did something Dinah had never seen before, collapsed inward. "No," he said, "he's not okay, and I couldn't help him." 3 days later, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley was found dead at Graceland. Dinah was with Dean when the news came on television. Dean watched the report without speaking. Then he stood up, walked to his room, and didn't come out for 2 days. When he finally emerged, he said one thing to his family: "I don't want to see any Elvis footage, not performances, not interviews, not anything. I can't watch him anymore." And he never did. To understand why Dean's 1969 warning to Elvis had been so specific and why Elvis's inability to follow it had been so predictable, you have to understand what Dean had seen in Elvis that he recognized from his own experience, and what was different between them in ways that made Dean's path unavailable to Elvis. Dean had built the Dean Martin character deliberately from the outside in, starting from a position of knowing exactly who Dino Crocetti was and constructing Dean Martin as a tool for Dino to use. The apple juice was the emblem of this, the glass that looked like whiskey, the performance of the drunk, maintained so completely that the world accepted it as reality, while Dean kept the actual reality entirely separate. He'd had the advantage of starting this construction as an adult, with a formed sense of self that predated the public persona and could survive alongside it. The line between Dino and Dean had always been there, had been part of the original design. Elvis had not had this advantage. He'd been 17 when Sun Records and Sam Phillips had begun turning Elvis Presley into something the world had never seen before. He'd been 21 when Ed Sullivan and the television appearances and the national hysteria had completed the transformation. He had never, at any point in his adult life, had the experience of being a private person with a public persona. He'd gone from being a private person to being a public phenomenon without the intervening stage where a man learns who he is when nobody's watching. The character hadn't been built on top of an existing self. It had replaced the existing self before the existing self had fully formed. Dean understood this difference, had articulated it in the 1969 conversation as clearly as the friendship allowed. But understanding the problem and being able to solve it were different things, and Elvis had been too far into replacement by 1969 to reverse it by choice. On August 16, 1977, 3 days after the phone call, Elvis Presley was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor at Graceland. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, complicated by the presence of multiple drugs in his system. The world's reaction was immediate and enormous, the kind of collective grief that only happens when a person has been so deeply woven into the fabric of popular culture that their absence creates a structural loss. Dunn heard the news in his Beverly Hills home, watched the initial television reports with the particular stillness of a man who already knew what he was being told, and then spent 2 days in his room, The family and staff who were present in the house during those 2 days described him as unreachable, not in distress in a way that required intervention, but simply absent, processing something at a depth that didn't have language. When he emerged, the refusal to watch Elvis footage was not presented as grief or as tribute or as anything that required explanation. It was simply stated he couldn't watch. He wouldn't. For the remaining 18 years of Dean's life. He died in December 1995. Whenever Elvis came on television, Dean left the room. The pattern was consistent enough that the people around him learned not to let it happen by accident, learned to manage the remote or the channel in contexts where Dean was present. It was the most visible evidence of something he never spoke about directly, the guilt that lives in the space between knowing you were right and knowing that being right wasn't sufficient to save anyone. The story of Elvis's last call to Dean Martin is not a story about failure. It is not a story about a man who could have been saved if someone had said the right thing or made the right offer. It is a story about the specific and irreversible way that fame, when it is total and early and unmediated, can replace the person it attaches to rather than adding to them. Elvis Presley gave the world something extraordinary, a voice, a presence, a transformation of American music that changed everything that came after. And the price of that giving was the gradual disappearance of the person who was doing the giving. Dean Martin saw this happening, tried to name it, tried to offer the one tool he possessed that might have helped, the knowledge that you could perform completely without becoming the performance, that Dino could survive Dean, that the character and the person could coexist if the line between them was drawn early and held firmly. Elvis understood what Dean was offering, said so, on August 13, 1977, at 2:47 in the morning. With the particular clarity that comes at the end of things. You were right. I should have listened. 7 words. The hardest kind of truth, the kind that arrives too late to be useful for anything except acknowledgement. Dean Martin cried for Elvis Presley not because he had failed to save him, but because he had loved him and recognized him and watched him disappear. And because the last thing Elvis Presley said to him was a thank you for seeing him when nobody else did. That was the gift Dean had given, not advice, not strategy, just seeing. And it was enough for Elvis to call at the end to say so. August 13, 1977, midnight, Elvis Presley called Dean Martin. 3 days before he died, you were right. I should have listened. 7 words that broke Dean Martin's heart. Dean tried to save him. Begged him to come to California, promised to help him find himself again. But Elvis had already made his decision. The call was a goodbye. 3 days later, Elvis was gone, and Dean Martin never watched another Elvis performance, couldn't bear to see the man who gave everything and kept nothing. If you want to see more stories about Dean Martin, the friendships he treasured, the warnings he gave, the grief he carried in silence, there's an entire playlist waiting. These stories don't stay online forever. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.